Okay, good morning, Dad. Today
Morning.
is Wednesday, December 4th, and there's a lot that's going on. And I'll just throw something at you and see if I don't even know if you've been paying attention to this.
Okay.
Have you heard about the South Korean president declaring martial law?
Oh yeah, that was quite a shock. I saw that yesterday morning. That was not something I was expecting, to be
Right.
honest.
So he declared martial law, and then what, like 6 hours later, he said, just kidding, and everything's back to normal.
Yeah.
So what happened? Can you tell us?
Okay. Well, I haven't been following the things in South Korea really very closely. Really just when it intersects with the larger issues that we usually discuss. North Korea and Russia, the Ukraine war. Then I look at it, and so I've known that this president was a real neocon, and in sharp contrast to the previous president. The previous president, under the previous president, South Korea had very good relations with Russia, and he also that previous administration also sought to avoid conflict with North Korea and improve relations with China too. But this new president is very much in the neocon mold, and has been so one of the things that we've mentioned earlier is that he actually uh, he made a decision to supply Ukraine, via the U.S. with hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. And this was clearly seen as a hostile act by Russia. It clearly was. And it may have contributed to Russia's decision to have to establish a full military alliance with North Korea. It was a stupid thing to do. It was one of these things. He just decided that he was going to make South Korea a vassal of um, of Western hegemony, and with predictable consequences. But that's uh, I think that's part of the reason that he's unpopular. That's the issues that we focus on. But domestic issues are always the most important thing, and I don't really know what the domestic issues were there in South Korea. But he was or is probably even more so now, a very unpopular president. He had an approval rating of just 25%. And the parliament was generally, opposed to his policies and was stonewalling you know, his his proposed legislation. So he wasn't getting anything through. And also, apparently, there was some impeachment proceedings had been brought against him. I think it may have been for corruption related issues. I think his wife is suspected of having engaged in some kind of corruption. Um, so altogether, this guy was, he was very unpopular. He was being threatened with impeachment. His wife was, potentially could end up in jail. And so what does he do? He essentially launches a military coup. He declares martial law. Now, this has happened in the past in South Korea. Over the not in the recent past. That's why it's such a surprise. But if you go like 20 years in the past and earlier, it was South Korea went in and out of martial law on more than one occasion. This time it didn't work, and I think it was South Korea has changed, and this guy was very unpopular. If you're going to do something like that, make sure that you have a strong base of support, and I don't think he had it. So the parliament, took a vote, and it was something like 190 to 0 against his martial law decision. And I guess the army was following his orders, but I think he may have suspected that he was losing control of this, and he wasn't going to, that the army at some point might refuse to follow his orders, and he realized that the game was up, and he abandoned he rescinded his orders, and now he is going to be, he's going to be impeached. I think there's no question he's going to be removed from office, and I think that's good for South Korea. I mean, that again, he's been, I think, a disastrous president. At least, again, on the foreign policy issues that I pay attention to.
So if he's impeached and a new president comes in to South Korea, will we see somebody that you think will not be a willing vassal of the United States, won't be a neocon, or will?
Yeah,
What I want to see is some real independence from these
right,
countries, and it's kind of surprising me. Why is it so difficult for countries to break away from U.S. hegemony? Because we see this
right.
all throughout Europe. Right, even Germany, the United States
Yeah,
blows up its largest energy
right.
infrastructure
It's
pipeline, the Nord Stream
extraordinary. Right.
2. and they just go along with it. All of Europe is the economy's in tatters. Everybody's upset. It doesn't seem like any of these countries are doing anything for in the interest of their own people. They're
Right.
doing it just at the behest of the United States. The United
Right.
States says you go, everybody's going down with us, and it seems like everybody's going along. You can say the same thing
Yeah.
for Japan,
Right.
South Korea, all of Europe, except for the exceptions of Slovakia and
Hungary.
Hungary. Right.
Right.
Well, why is that? What is it that? What is the? How does that happen?
Well, yeah, it's hard. I mean, I guess it's over time. The U.S. has worked to subjugate these countries. They're constantly applying pressure at different points, so that they want to see friendly people in their institutions. They've subverted the media in these countries. Like in Germany, I think it was revealed recently, and it was known earlier that like the CIA had connections with just virtually every German media outlet, which would explain why we're getting these ridiculous stories, for example, about the Ukrainian role in blowing up the pipeline. I think that's pure nonsense, but that's a story that the CIA is regularly feeding the German media. Um, Even so, you could say, well, why can't we just have, a leader somewhere just say, no, it's not like the U.S. is actually going to invade. And if you had a leader that pointed out, revealed that the U.S. had, allowed a fair investigation to go forward and revealed that the U.S. had blown up the pipeline, the popular anger would be so great that I don't think that leader would have any problems, in defying the U.S. and steering a more independent course. Um, I think the reason is that their minds have been colonized. It's just like this neoconservative ideology has conquered them, conquered their minds over the years. If you go back, not even too long ago, let's say the beginning of the Iraq War, during the months prior to Iraq War. Well, we had countries in Europe that were independent, like France at that time. France prided itself for decades of being independent. They weren't actually a part of NATO until I don't know exactly when it happened, but for a long time they weren't. They pursued an independent foreign policy. And it was part of being French, and that was important to the French political class. But this neocon influence was always there. It was always being applied, and eventually it proved victorious. I can't explain why, again, because it's not in the interests of Europe. But that's what's happened, and so that these people cannot think, um, uh, on their own. Really, I mean, they're in the end they have become vassals. It's in ideologically, in every aspect of the relationship. They've subordinated themselves to the U.S. and they don't seem to be able to look at the world in any different way. And I don't know like the history of what's happened in South Korea, but I imagine it's very similar. So again, the U.S. has managed to shape. A lot of times, I know this happens at the Taiwan, may very well in South Korea too. A lot of students go to the U.S. to pursue graduate students studies, and then during that time they kind of pick up American ideology, and I think you can see the results of that in Taiwan. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens in South Korea as well.
So how does like the CIA or just the US control media across all these other different countries? Because you said that in Germany that basically they are just sort of fed stories by the CIA. I also
Uh-huh.
heard it's the same thing in places like Japan as well. They basically parrot the US position in the media.
Yeah.
So it's really surprising to me. Like how could you not have an independent media in your country
Right.
that you
Right.
just get someone just hands you something. I mean, that's not media anymore, right? And this is
Right.
part of the larger problem of just whole
Yeah.
distrust in all institutions now in the
Right.
West. But
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's the same thing. We used to have a fairly independent media, that journalists prided themselves in being cynical, hard boiled and wanting to, expose corruption among the powerful. Often they actually came from the working classes, back then, like up through the 60s. Um, but that's changed. Now you have people that come out of elite institutions and and go from there into the New York Times, and for it's all part of they identify with the ruling class. That's who they are, and I'm sure the same thing's happening in Europe.
Okay, so they just feel like they're part of this, the halls of power, they're close to it,
Yeah,
and the
well, they
center
right,
is the
but
United States, it's DC, it's the
yeah,
Pentagon, it's the CIA, and it
right.
just
It's
makes them
like
feel good.
right. They
And
think it's the great and the good. That's part of it. It's kind of amazing when you look and you see the awful things that are done by these people, but they feel that they are like the kingdom of good. They're the morally pure. They're and that in a way kind of justifies everything they do. If maybe um, you know they may bend the rules here, lie about this, but it's all because they're the good people and they're defending the good empire. And we have to stick it to the bad people.
Mhm. Do you think that the majority of these problems that are arising in part of the, I guess we call it the U.S. Hegemonic umbrella, Western Europe, South Korea, Japan, Australia, all these countries that are having economic woes, unrest, all the leaders are quite unpopular for the most part. Is
Yeah,
that all stemming from the fact that the U.S. hegemony is in decline and that we're trying to turn the screws and bend things to our will and it's not working? Is Do you believe
I think
that's the
that's a
problem?
good. That's no question. That's a big part of it. I mean, what Europe has made a very serious mistake. By simply, as this multipolar world, emerges, it makes I think a rational person looking at that says, okay, this is an opportunity. We can now actually, establish relations with many different poles of power, and that gives us more room for maneuver. It makes us more independent, and we can pursue our own interests more effectively. That's what a multipolar world allows you to do. But they chose not to. They chose to go running to the U.S. and then kind of just throw themselves on the you know on the U.S.'s just
Funeral
it,
pyre.
yeah, well, right. Yeah, I guess you could say that. But anyway, yeah, they've made themselves vassals of the U.S. Especially since the war, they're just utterly dependent. That's the choice that they made, was to simply, to ally themselves ever more firmly with the U.S. and simply to obey, all of the U.S.'s diktats. And so they've lost a lot of their sovereignty as a result, and they have lost these opportunities to build mutually beneficial relations with other countries in the world. It's like it's not just the U.S. Um, doesn't only pressure them to be hostile, and that's putting it mildly, to Russia. Again, as we can see, with disastrous economic consequences. But it's also pressuring them to be hostile to China,
Right.
and it just makes it's so that's going to be disastrous too. It already is. Um, None of these are to the benefit of Europe, and meanwhile, the U.S. is kind of making off as a bandit. As Europe goes down, a lot of their companies are going to the U.S. because the U.S. is offering them tax breaks, and the U.S. still has cheap energy. Europe doesn't. I mean, it's just it's I don't know, astoundingly stupid. I mean, it's really hard to believe sometimes that how stupid these people are. Um, you know, some of them, I guess, probably do have fairly high IQs, but they're still, I guess, just they're so blinded by this ideology that they just, they're incapable of making rational decisions.
Yeah, you think that's really what it is? Sometimes I'm thinking something more conspiratorial, like, or
Uh-huh.
do they have dirt on them,
Well,
or are
that
they like
happens. That's
threatening
that.
them?
Yeah, I doubt that they have dirt on all of them. They may have on some individuals, and that may be part of it. I mean, that's what intelligence agencies do. Um, and it may be part of how they corrupted these institutions over the years, but it's only part of it. I think these people, as they become true believers, I don't think there's any question about it.
Right. Well, in becoming true believers, they are becoming traitors to their own countries. They
Hmm.
are not helping their people. They have a duty to pursue policies that are in the interest of their people, their country. And if you just take a look at, if we just compare BRICS to the US-led bloc, it's just night and day. And I think most people can see it, that they can see that, okay, this is the future, BRICS, the multipolar world. And everybody, why are we clinging on to this self-destructive evil empire, essentially? I just don't get it.
Well, of course, the people that within the West, the vast majority, unfortunately, don't see it. People outside, the West see it very clearly, and they're just scratching their heads, or making their decisions to move away from the West and head towards BRICS. That's happening all over the world. But within the West, there's still, like we've talked about it in many different ways, there's still this abiding faith in both the power and the goodness of the West. I mean, it's just like for them, that's an eternal truth, and they just can't get their heads around that. It's not true. It never was true to the extent that they imagine it, but it's certainly a lot less true than it was, say, in the 1990s.
Mm. Do you think that, what's happened in South Korea, it's kind of exposing sort of this thin veil between democracy and authoritarianism? Because what's happening now, as the ship goes down, we've talked about this, there are two paths that these countries can take. They can see if their democratic institutions are truly sound, and they can vote in a new leader that actually represents the will of the people of the country, right, or that they'll go more lockdown. And what we've seen a lot is lockdown. We've seen Germany talking about banning the AfD. We saw the national rally denied its position in the French government by this coalition between the right, capitalists and the socialists, the establishment.
Even though it won the elections, right?
Right. So do you think that what path do you think we're going to be seeing it taking? Is it going to continue to get more and more authoritarian, or do we think that these democratic institutions actually do have some meaning? Because it's crazy to me that in South Korea that it's supposed to be a democracy where a president just says, okay, martial law, and then obviously didn't work, but it just kind of, for me, I think it woke up a lot of people in South Korea, like, whoa, what country do we live in actually? They can't just say like lock you down or say you have to do this and obey us, and then the army comes in. And I mean, the idea that Ukraine is a democracy, obviously, I think is pretty much a joke. I mean, Zelensky's term expired a long time ago, but
and all the opposition parties were banned quite a long time, and it's important to point out that these anti-democratic trend started well before the special military operation in 2022. Ukraine is nowhere near a democratic society, and it hasn't been for a long time, and it's just absurd. It's held up as like, here's this bastion of democracy against evil authoritarian Russians. But we know that, and it's all about whose side you're on. Democracy is just an excuse. And, obviously they're not interested in the substance of democracy. They just redefine democracy to mean, are you on our side or not? And Georgia, for example, though they haven't been pro-Russian, actually, they've been somewhat hostile to Russia, over the last few years. They have refused to sanction Russia. They have refused to be, hostile in the way that the Europeans want them to be. And so that's why their democracy is not democracy. The results of their election are unacceptable. And their president, who can't even speak Georgian but speaks French, because that's where she was born and raised, is refusing to step down. So, there's another example of, in the name of democracy, I'm not going to listen to the will of the voters.
Yeah. Well, if you see on X Twitter, when we're talking about Tbilisi and Georgia, what's going on there, it's all, Georgia will never be Russia. Say no to Russian oppression. We need to fight for fair and free democracies. That's everything that's being said there. Right. So maybe we can segue into Georgia right now. So Can you tell us what's happening there? Just recap. I know we had a episode on it a couple months ago, but we have new listeners now. So maybe you can kind of tell us what's going on.
Okay, well, what we're witnessing right now is just a textbook case of a color revolution. And it was actually, this has been tried so many times previously in Georgia. You know, they had a color revolution, one of the first ones. I think it was in the early 2000s. And maybe it was Shevardnadze that was overthrown. Typically, what happens is that an election is held, and then the opposition comes out. The opposition, which you have to understand, is funded and organized and trained by Western NGOs. And I've heard that Georgia has like the greatest concentration of Western NGOs of any country in the world. Um, um, Now, these Western NGOs, they're well funded and they're operating in a poor country. So they can actually afford to pay like $10 an hour, even $20 an hour, which is just a phenomenal salary in a place like Georgia or Moldova or wherever. So, not only, so they really can buy influence, they can just buy loyalty. And, they train these people, these young people. And then when the election occurs and the wrong person wins, the one who isn't enthusiastic about joining the EU or whatever, wants to maintain decent relations with Russia, well, then they hit the streets, and they've been trained in carrying out street protests, and then immediately the Western media supports them, and Western leaders come and actually go and visit them and show their support. Think of Victoria Nuland and the cookies in Maidan Square, right? That was another color revolution that ended the tragedy, obviously, in Ukraine. um, but I think the important, but so far anyway, of course, the color revolutionaries succeeded in Ukraine as they succeeded in other countries. They managed to overthrow a duly elected government and install a government to their liking, but they haven't succeeded in Georgia, and it seems like that the Georgia Dream Party and their prime minister has, maybe because they've seen it happen so many times, they observed what happened in Ukraine, and in fact they bring this up again and again. We're not going to be like Ukraine. Look what happened. This is what, if these people win, our future is Ukraine. And I think that probably resonates with a lot of Georgians. But even so, you see a lot of Ukrainian flags, among the protesters. And it must be said, there's all this talk about Russian influence. Nobody's found any Russians there anywhere involved in this. But I've heard that that a third of the people the protesters that have been arrested recently are foreigners.
That's what I've heard as well.
Right.
Oh, 30% of the people being detained and arrested aren't even citizens of Georgia.
Yeah, and you have
the protests.
You have European MPs and going there and giving speeches, against Russian influence, which doesn't exist. But they don't seem to, the hypocrisy doesn't. They don't seem to be aware of what they're doing. Obviously they're interfering. But again, right, because they're the good people, it doesn't matter. So
right. So right. We have the president of Georgia. Can you quickly maybe kind of define the distinction between the president of Georgia and the prime minister of Georgia? Because that's a little confusing. When people hear the president, they think that this is the person that is really calling all the shots, but that's not really the case in Georgia, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, president and prime minister have different meanings in different countries. In Georgia, the prime minister is the one with real power, and the president is largely a ceremonial post. The prime minister is a French citizen, the former, I believe, French ambassador to.
You mean the president? You mix it up.
Yeah, the president. Okay, yeah, the president. Yeah, the president. She's really a French woman. She is of Georgian ancestry, but she was born and raised in France, and can only speak a little bit of Georgian. She's basically French, but somehow she managed to occupy this position of the presidency in Georgia, and she's been using it throughout the protests, to condemn the government. I know earlier she was saying repeatedly that there was Russian involvement, the Russians were behind it. And then somebody actually asked her, for evidence. And if I recall correctly, she said, well, I don't have to. Like they didn't have to give any evidence in the U.S. about, Russian interference. So I'm not going to give what.
We set the precedent,
Yeah, that's
so.
right. So anyway, now, recently she's continued to support the protesters, condemn the police, describe it as brutal and the protesters as peaceful. And clearly they're not. I've seen a lot of video, they're smashing windows and they're throwing firecrackers, and they've got this pyrotechnic gun that's pretty impressive, that shoots flames, and the police seem to be doing a very professional job. The thing is, I think, again, we have to give credit to the Georgian president and the Georgian Dream Party. They seem to...
The Georgian prime minister. You keep on mixing them up.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
The
Georgian prime minister and the Georgian Dream Party. I think they've learned the lessons from previous color revolutions. For example, in Ukraine, it was Poroshenko, not Poroshenko, no, Lukashenko, I believe.
Yanukovych.
I'm sorry. Okay, Yanukovych. You're right.
I got your back. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. I do these things with names from time to time for some reason. Okay, but Yanukovych, he was the president, and he was the one who was, targeted by all these protests, and rather than cracking down, if he really was some evil authoritarian, he was constantly trying to negotiate with them, meet them halfway. He was kept on ceding ground, and every time he ceded ground to them, they just took it and they pushed harder, and eventually just pushed him out. Is what happened. It ended with a false flag incident, by the way, but the Georgian prime minister has not done that. He's held his ground firmly. I mean, they haven't, cracked down violently, but they've been forceful. They have not ceded ground. They're not letting them camp out. They're trying to establish a permanent presence there right in front of the parliament building, and they keep on pushing them back. I think now they're increasing the number of arrests, and they may continue to do that, but it seems like he's handled it very effectively. But the president, the so-called Georgian president, has recently declared that she's not going to step down. She's supposed to step down within a couple of weeks, but she's not going to step down again in the name of democracy, of course. And she's completely supported by all the Western European leaders.
So did the West, did the US, the EU, did they essentially appoint this woman, Salome? Did they back her and put her in as this president?
I'm sure they pulled a lot of strings. I don't know exactly how it happened. I really don't know.
And do you think she's receiving orders from people in Brussels or Paris or wherever?
I don't think she probably is to some extent, but I don't think they have to give her orders. She's just one of them, And they all know they're of one mind on these things. Anybody that's all friendly to Russia is bad. Anybody who refuses to obey, the EU is evil and is obviously, a Russian stooge. And that's the way they all talk, the way they all think. And she's just one of them.
So you don't think this color revolution will succeed? It looks like the people are aware of what's going on, right? It's becoming more apparent.
I think that I believe, and I certainly hope that the Georgia Dream Party succeeds. It looks like they're going to. But you just have to keep in mind that Georgia is a small, relatively poor country, against some very powerful forces. The U.S. and the EU, they're powerful and they have a lot of levers to pull. And, though this NGO law was passed, those NGOs are still there. They do have to now declare their funding. That was Georgia's first sin, is that they actually demanded transparency.
But this is a law that's pretty commonplace across countries. And, the U.S. definitely has this. I mean, most European
I think it's even modeled on the U.S. law. So, I mean, it just... the hypocrisy is breathtaking. It just is. But it's just like these people don't, obviously, they just think, we're one class of people. Again, it's the rules-based international order, and that means that we make the rules and we give the orders. That's, it sounds like an exaggeration, but it clearly is the way they think. It's just like, hey, they didn't obey our orders. Obviously they're not Democrats or, they need to be punished.
So these a third or 30% of these protesters are claimed to be citizens of other countries.
Well, they are citizens of other countries, yeah.
Right. Okay. So, but are we funding them to go there? So is this a coordinated effort from
quite possibly? I mean, these NGOs, right? These NGOs have a lot of money. One of the it's not exactly an NGO actually, because it is a government organization. It's the National Endowment for Democracy has a large presence in Georgia, and that is, in fact, it's basically. It used to be a department of the CIA, and then the CIA a couple of decades ago decided to just make it public, but it clearly its relationship to the CIA did not end when it became the NED, and they're there and they support the other NGOs, and there's a lot of money that flows through there. There was some claim, for example, that $5 billion was spent in Ukraine to support, the anti-government, anti-Russian forces there.
Does the CIA, National Endowment of Democracy, they just have unlimited money? Are they just connected straight up to the U.S. printing press? So that's why they can just do this, and they just...
Well, they don't have unlimited money, but clearly they have a lot of money. And the thing to remember, again, is that in these countries, that money goes a long way. If you can pay somebody $10 an hour, I mean, it's like paying somebody $80 an hour in this country. And it's like a young person out of college having trouble finding a job and thinking, I got to work in a cafe or something, and I can get this kind of work. This is great. I love this country. This is wonderful. Yeah, I'll go out and, throw rocks and smash windows for this country.
Shoot fireworks. People should go on Twitter and just type in Tbilisi, because I've never seen this many fireworks used in a protest. The amount of...
It's rather entertaining, I agree.
Yeah, it almost looks like... it reminded me of like the Clone Wars and Star Wars, laser blasters going across each side. It's really something to behold. So it seems like it's heating up. To me, it looks like.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw these...
Right. What I've heard is the crowds are dwindling. Actually, the numbers out there. But the ones that are still there are increasingly violent. And maybe we're getting more and more people from, abroad, real kind of professional agitators. And as it becomes apparent to them that they're losing, they may do something. We may see a false flag like we saw in the Maidan.
What was the false flag in Maidan? Was it the snipers?
It was actually, there were snipers, that shot... I think they shot the police there, and they were firing from a hotel. There's I can't remember. I think it was a Canadian journalist who did very, very good work on it. But then it was pinned. Okay. I can't remember the details. I won't try to. Okay. But the thing is, it was actually carried out. Actually, I think by Azov types. The ultranationalists in Ukraine, but it was pinned on the police. But it wasn't. It was shown later, like the firing was from a hotel, and that was occupied by these Azov types. But it was blamed on, again, government, law enforcement, and that was the spark that finally set the fire that brought down Yanukovych. He ended up fleeing to Russia.
So you think that's a real risk here in Georgia, that there will be a false flag? But do you think that most Georgian people are aware, especially if it's getting out that, hey, most of these people that are shooting at our parliament building, they're not even Georgian anymore. Who are these people? Get out of our country.
It's going to be harder for them to pull out. I mean, it's clear that Georgia learned from these previous color revolutions, especially the one in Ukraine. And they're bringing it up, and they're pointing out the parallels. And so it's going to be harder for them to pull it off. But I think there's a very good chance they'll try, create some kind of incident. As they get desperate and see that it's not working and their numbers are dwindling, it's more likely that they're going to do something desperate.
Yeah, it feels like the jig is up for the United States. The veil, the mask has been lifted. People see what the U.S. is doing now, these color revolutions. When you go down that rabbit hole, you realize how often we do this. And I think it's becoming more and more apparent to the rest of the world what's happening. So I just don't, and that's really our our
Yeah,
forte, our specialty is regime change, our
yeah.
color
Right. We have
revolutions.
it's a playbook. I mean, we've used it again and again, and it with great success. Um, yeah, no, I think obviously a lot of people around the world have wisened up to it. But then it also must be said that, like in Georgia, though that they're a minority, there is a substantial minority that's enthusiastically supportive of this. So, I mean, they still have a hold on a lot of people. It's amazing. I was amazed, that there were Iranians that still, after all these years of these cruel economic sanctions and assassinations and everything, clearly carried out by the U.S. and Israel, and with the support of the West in general, that there were still Iranians that were pro-Western. You found them in the universities. But from what I hear, again, according to Professor Morandi, it's just like the genocide in Gaza has pretty much ended that. It's just they all along had this abiding faith in the West as being the land of the good, the great and the good, and if they're sanctioning us and assassinating our leaders, well, obviously it's for our own good or something. But then they saw the genocide in Gaza and they said, wait a second, and apparently it's like that Western pro-Western element is pretty much evaporated. But still, in places like Georgia, it's also, my understanding, it's pretty much gone in Russia too. There used to be a strong pro-Western element. It's gone. But in places like Georgia, it's still there and it's substantial and it is a threat to the government.
Right. I
But
think that's just
but I think the trend, you're right, is just against them, and that more and more people are having their eyes opened.
right.
Are
I think it's a testament to U.S. soft power.
yeah.
Our movies, the music, everybody sees it. America always looked cool. I can
Hmm.
see as a young person in another country just
Right.
getting that image of greatness from the United States was intoxicating. But it's definitely on the decline. One last question about the Georgia thing, or this is actually just a more general question. Why is it called a color revolution? Where does that come from?
I
Do you
can't.
know?
I think it was the first. I can't remember what the first one was. Maybe it was in Georgia. It was the Rose Revolution, I believe. And so it was just one. It was a random thing. The protesters decided to associate themselves with a color. It wasn't so much the flower, but just a rose color. And um, well, I mean, roses come in different colors, so anyway. Yeah, but anyway, I think it started off with rose, but then like the next one just called itself the lavender or whatever. And the orange. I think there was an orange revolution in Ukraine in the early 2000s. Um, it just a pattern got established, and they referenced back to the early one, and that I think that's just a purely by chance. It was something that was seized upon and then just became the kind of the standard operating procedure.
Okay. All right. Well, let's pivot over to the Middle East again. We were talking a lot about Syria recently. I've just seen some headlines about Russia and Iran now coming to aid the Syrian army to push out this terrorist army that's taking over parts of Aleppo. Can you update us on what's going on and where you see this conflict going?
Yeah, I think it's more of the same. It's clear. It looks like the terrorists. We can also call them jihadists or Salafists. Because that's what they are. Um, have after their initial surprising and very extensive gains have their advance has been checked and they're in fact now being pushed back. Um, so that's good news. The Syrian army has managed to kind of regroup and is now fighting successfully against them. It's still they're a long way from taking back Aleppo, and I think they need to do that fairly quickly, like over the next couple of months, and then just not give them a chance to dig in, or we're going to have an awful, maybe years-long siege. God forbid, but there's a real chance of that. One bit of I got this from Alexander Mercouris. He said he has his sources, and his source, he said, is which has proved itself to be reliable, said that one of the reasons that the takeover of Aleppo happened so rapidly is that in the months leading up to the attack, the jihadists had infiltrated lots of different cells into Aleppo. So when they attacked Aleppo, at the same time they activated the cells. So there was, they were being attacked from the north and within, and so this it just led to chaos, and they weren't able to put up an organized defense. That sounds very likely. That would make sense. Helped explain why Aleppo fell so rapidly.
Hmm. Can you tell me, what the position publicly stated from the United States, Israel, and Turkey is? Because it seems kind of convoluted when you try to read mainstream media.
Yeah.
They don't really give you a side. They kind of distance
Yeah.
themselves from the
Right.
terrorist army, but they're supporting them at the same time.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah.
kind of confusing. So what
Right.
is
Well,
the...
I mean, the thing is, the ridiculous thing is that the U.S. has officially recognized HTS which is the main force, within this coalition of forces, um, as a terrorist entity. And yet, so here, they're admitting that the Assad government is being attacked by this terrorist army. And so on that level they are. But at the same time, they won't express support for Assad and said, well, he needs to talk to them or whatever. So, clearly, yeah, they're, like you say, they don't. And then they also announce that we're not actually supporting this. Nobody asked you that question, but obviously they
felt
know.
compelled to say it.
Yeah,
So.
they say it out loud.
Right.
What is it, Shakespeare? Yeah, methinks thou protestest too much, or whatever the Shakespeare. I think I probably butchered that, but anyway.
Way to go.
Yeah, yeah. So clearly, they're obfuscating, and Turkey's pretending like it's like, oh, we have nothing to do with this. I haven't heard a single person suggest that Turkey is not behind this. I think everybody knows that Turkey's behind it. And it's kind of funny that even the Russians and Iranians who've got to know and be very upset about this, kind of pretend are going along with Erdogan. I think it's just like it's their experience in dealing with Erdogan. Is that well, we'll let him save some face, but underneath we're going to tell him, hey, you can't do this. There are going to be these consequences for you. And I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, because Erdogan made some statement about, we need to respect the sovereignty of Syria or something like that.
Yeah.
But at the
He
same
obviously
time,
doesn't. He hasn't respected it for many, many years, not since 2011. He has his own soldiers camped out there. He obviously doesn't respect the sovereignty of Syria.
right. It's a strange thing that's happening because Erdogan has recently talked with Putin. And, Erdogan's trying to have a good relationships with Putin and Russia still.
Right.
But at the same time, if he's doing this in Syria and Russian soldiers are being killed and now Russia and Iran are both coming to the aid to help push out the force that Erdogan has funded and backed. But at least they're able to talk. That's something that we're not able to do. We can't talk with Russia.
Right. Well, again, they understand what kind of creature he is. I'm sure they're furious, but they believe they can. They'll have to push him back, and then make some deal with him that he'll probably break somewhere down. But I think they understand. They do understand exactly who they're dealing with, and they know the best way to solve this problem.
Erdogan, the Turkey, is this a democratic country as well? Are there going to be elections soon? I just can't imagine what he's doing being popular.
Right. I mean, there's been what we call like a erosion of certain democratic as institutions. I think he's kind of centralized power during his years in power. I remember, Turkey has really changed over the years. It used to be openly secular. Of course, modern Turkey was founded by Ataturk, who was a secular modernizing figure, and he established a secular government, and it kind of kept the Islamists and Islam in general in check. But gradually over time, as has happened in many Muslim countries, the power of Islam began to, experience a resurgence. And Erdogan, I understand, rode that wave, so he gets the support of the very strong Muslim majority in Turkey. That's one reason why he wins these elections. And
Probably not
the
now, though,
reason,
right? I mean,
well,
what?
maybe, well, no, it's hard to say. I mean, because again, I don't know. It seems like he's probably had some success in just fooling the majority because he did break diplomatic relations with Israel. He gives these fiery speeches condemning Israel, and to big crowds that cheer him, and I think most of them believe. Again, his government has. I don't think they absolutely control the press. It's not. Um, there's a fair good amount of freedom in Turkey, um, but I'm sure the government aligned press, supports his lies and probably supporting his lies about what's going on in Syria. And most people believe him, just like most people in the U.S. actually believe what our government says.
Okay. Well, maybe we can end on something that you mentioned in the last episode we did, but I just kind of glossed over it. And then when I was editing clips and listened to it again, I was like, I need to know more about this. You mentioned when we're talking about just how crazy and complicated the Syrian conflict is. You
Yeah.
mentioned at one point the CIA was funding a private army in Syria, and the Pentagon was also funding another private army in Syria. And at one point, the CIA army was fighting the Pentagon's army.
Yeah,
Can you
that's what
tell
I
me?
recall. I
Can
can't
you tell
tell
me
you
more
it.
about that?
I wish I could tell you more. I just, I was following the conflict more or less at the time, and I remember that. Um, I got that from Scott Horton it used to be Anti-War Radio. It's now the Scott Horton Show. Um, and yeah, I mean, it was not just one rumor, but I think it was well known. It's, what the U.S. was doing through different agencies is that they were organizing um, their own militias. Actually, I don't think any of these were very successful. What tended to happen was, well, because they didn't want to be openly associated with Al Qaeda. At that time, it was, we now call it HTS. At that time, it was Al Nusra. We were secretly on their side. And of course, as that email from Jake Sullivan revealed in 2012. Um, but, that is bad press. So what we would do is we'd organize these militias. We'd find a bunch of people who were willing to accept arms and training from us. And we would call them like the Syrian Democratic Army or something like that. And actually, the majority of them were jihadists. They took the training, they took the arms, and then the day that it ended, they ran off and they joined Al Nusra, and the others, or if they're just pure mercenary types, just self-interested. The moment it ended, they went and they sold their guns to Al Nusra, and that's just what happened. And I think I remember like emails were revealed, just discussing just that fact. We knew it was happening. But it was just a way of, in the end, we were supporting the anti-government forces, and the real anti-government forces were all jihadists. At the very beginning, there were some actual, Democrats, people who wanted to, bring elections and so forth to Syria at the very, very beginning of the Arab Spring there. But that was very short-lived. Very, very quickly, they were hijacked by these jihadists. That was a real military force. And so there was, we had this pretense that they still existed, and we would create these militias and give them a label and give them the guns and training, but it all went to the head choppers and the jihadis.
Mm. Okay. I also want to just touch on another thing is just the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. It's been showing signs of lots of cracks.
Yeah.
Do you see it breaking soon? Are we looking at basically a reignition of the hostilities there? What are you seeing?
Yeah. There have been many, many, many violations, I think almost entirely by Israel. They've been bombing, they continue to bomb Lebanon, and I heard that they seized another village that they weren't able to seize during their invasion. And so, it just doesn't look like it's very likely to last the whole 60 days. It's just, I think it's quite possible that hostilities will resume in full You know,
if they're bombing Lebanon and taking villages in Lebanon, then we can
yeah,
just say that the ceasefire doesn't exist, right? Why is
right.
Hezbollah letting this happen?
Yeah, well, you know, I guess, I don't know, but I can just, speculate. It's just that they do feel like they need some time to regroup and yeah, again, you remember at the beginning of this conflict, they suffered some grievous losses. They clearly their communication systems had been severely compromised. That there maybe there are high level moles because the Israelis seem to know where all their top leaders were, and that was that's something that maybe they decided we need to figure this out before we get back into this. That's one possibility, and maybe they're reorganizing, establishing a new communication system, and that takes a little bit of time. There's also the conflict in Syria, and they say that hey, we got to make sure that Syria doesn't blow up on us before we get back into a war with Israel, because if it does, we're going to lose this war. So that may be another thing. Again, that's just pure speculation. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, with Russia and Iran, moving into Syria, this I feel like that force should be able to handle the terrorist army. I don't imagine this HTS Al Nusra lasting long
Yeah.
in Syria. And then, is there a possibility if these troops are already there in Syria that they might be able to join the fight with Hezbollah and come to Lebanon's aid? Was there any chance that there would be maybe not Russian but Iranian
Um,
forces?
I I don't think so. For whatever reason, that's they Iran. Actually, I mean, Iranians do go to. Remember, like when Nasrallah was killed, there was a brigadier general, an Iranian brigadier generals there, so they do go and meet with them. But I don't think they've ever sent forces. I think first of all, probably Hezbollah doesn't need them. That Hezbollah has a substantial force that really knows the territory in a way that the Iranians do not. They know how to fight off the Israelis. They've proven it. So I don't think they need them. And then, the Iranians also just don't want to give the Israelis in the West any more excuses. Not that it seems to really matter, any more excuses to attack them. It seems like Israel's pretty good at inventing excuses, but for whatever reason, they've never done that. I don't think they need to, and I don't think they will.
What do you make of Trump's threat to the Palestinians in Gaza, saying if you don't release these hostages, there will be hell to pay? I mean, they're living through a genocide, so I
Yeah,
don't know
right.
how much
I
more
don't
hell
think
there is to
anybody
pay.
there has paid any attention to that. It doesn't make a bit of sense. I mean, what could he do that the Israelis haven't done already? Right?
I don't know.
Yeah,
Send U.S. special forces into Gaza. I don't know.
yeah. I don't think he'll do that. All his bluster. I don't think he knows that's unpopular, and he doesn't. I don't think he likes having the U.S. forces directly involved. So it's just an empty threat. Just one of those things that Trump says without much thought.
Hmm.
It's just tough talk with you know without any meaning.
Do you see much hope for the Palestinians? I mean, it sounded like, they've obviously been suffering terribly. It's been well over a year now since
Yeah,
October 7th and this ongoing bombing and starvation. And but now with Hezbollah in the ceasefire, Hezbollah being pulled off, and this distraction in Syria is taking eyes off of the crisis in Gaza. I imagine. I mean, there's only your willpower and your spirit can only carry you so far.
yeah,
Do you think
yeah,
that the
yeah.
Palestinians are going to break? How I don't
Well,
feel as
yeah,
hopeful
yeah,
for Palestine now that I did
yeah.
maybe a month ago, I would say.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. They don't show any signs of breaking. I think, Hamas continues to put up stiff resistance. They're not making it, even though, again, the Israelis have overwhelming firepower. They're not finding it all easy, even in this devastated northern Gaza. So there's no signs of them breaking. But you're right, there is a limit to what any people can withstand. Um, I don't know. It's a,
Okay,
Well, it's
well,
amazing. I mean, the Palestinians have hung on as long as they have. Again, both of us have been in the West Bank, and you go into these communities and you look, see the Israeli settlements up on the hill overlooking them, and you know that it's the constant harassment and abuse and killings and so on that these people are subjected to. That they've been subjected to for generations. And he's just saying, like, how are you still here? I think um, I would have, I'm afraid that I would have given up at some point and just say, I'm sorry, I can't take this anymore. I'm just going to get out of here somehow.
mhm.
But a lot of them, they just have, these are villages that their ancestors lived in for centuries or even millennia. And I guess it's hard for us to understand, the extent to how deep the roots can be for people. Yeah, so
Yeah, it's such a tragedy, this ongoing horror. I mean, right, people, this obviously, whatever happened since October 7th, things have really gotten really bad for people in Gaza and
yeah,
also in the West Bank. But this has been going on, like we said, for over 70 years.
yeah,
This type of subjugation and this humiliation and
right,
the killings, the stealing of land, burning olive groves and shooting their
yeah,
water towers, just everything.
right,
And it's so, it's distressing knowing that we belong to a country is that is funding this, that is supporting
yeah,
this, that is allowing
wow,
this to happen.
yeah.
And it's just, I don't know, I think in my lifetime we'll see it end. We'll see it change.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's where
I think that's realistic. I mean, it's just the horror, of course, is intensified, but at the same time, um, I am more hopeful anyway that Zionism will fail in the foreseeable future. I didn't have that hope at all prior to October 7th. It looked like that's why I think it was Jake Sullivan that said that, hey, the Middle East has never been so peaceful. And it just like basically the Zionists had won. The neighboring countries had come to terms with it, including Saudi Arabia, and the Palestinians had been essentially neutralized, silenced, and we weren't hearing from them, and it just seemed to be over. Uh, and but now, I mean, uh, the now that's not true. I just Israel's reaction has, I think, actually put Israel itself at risk, has put its own existence at risk in a way that it wasn't before. I mean, again, it's just like the change in the world opinion towards Israel just couldn't be more dramatic. They are in a much more precarious position. It's not just a matter of attitudes towards Israel, but it's those attitudes really shape how other countries relate to Israel, including how they relate to them economically. And they whatever happens, I don't think they're ever going to recover from what they've done.
okay. Well, let's end it there, Dad.
Okay,
Okay. Have a good rest of your day.
you too.